Welcome, everybody. My name is Scott Winter, and today I'm excited to interview author, friend, colleague Jim Tam, the author of Radical Collaboration. Jim, I met a couple years ago after realizing that the world needed to be better at collaborating, and looked up the term radical collaboration, and I stumbled across this TED Talk. I think I sent you an email immediately. And I was I think I was in Cuernavaca, Mexico a few weeks later going through the training. And then it's been quite a whirlwind. But I'm really excited, Jim, and I'm glad you can make some time for the call. Because for those of you who don't know, Jim's in the process of republishing his book, which is coming out December 24th, correct?
That's right. Second edition.
Second edition.
HarperCollins.
So what I wanted to do is give the audience, welcome David, give the audience an opportunity to kind of just learn a little bit about, because the book came out in 2004, correct?
December 24th, 2004. So HarperCollins seems to be consistent on their publication dates.
So it's been 15 years since the first edition came out. And I really want to use this time to kind of get a sense from you, kind of what's changed in over the years in terms of how you've seen the dynamics in organizations have changed, and how the 5 skills of collaboration, how you've kind of, did you have to make any adjustments? But before we jump into all that, just give us a little sense of your background for those people who may not be as familiar as I am with you, and then kind of what inspired you to get the first edition out there.
Sure. Well, first, thank you for having me on. It's always a pleasure to connect with you.
Yeah.
So for most of my career, I was a senior administrative law judge with the state of California for almost 25 years. And I had jurisdiction over collective bargaining disputes. So it was all employment conflicts. And I did that until about 15 years ago now, I guess. And I retired. And since then, I have been teaching in a number of different programs. Over the years, I've taught at Santa Clara University Law School, the Harvard University Talent Development Program. I'm currently teaching in the International Management Program at the Stockholm School of Economics, and the Leadership Academy at the University of California, and the Wallenberg Institute in Sweden. And let's see where else, some executive MBA programs in Latin America, at NASA. So I spend a fair amount of time on the road, going to different places to teach.
Why do people call you up? I mean, I know the book came out, but what's been their pain point, and why would someone want to? I mean, of course, you're a great person and you do great work, but what's kind of the catalyst? Because again, I mean, in the commons, which we're trying to build with the Collaborative Commons, is tools, resources to help people be effective out there. Yeah. But I mean, I understand people want to learn this stuff, but what are people generally? What's the impetus for them to call you and reach out?
I think it's 2 things. Most of the work that I'm doing now is with high-end leaders in executive leadership programs. And I think there is a much greater awareness that for leaders to be effective, they need to be skilled at collaboration. That's one of the changes that I've seen over the years, is there's much more awareness about how essential it is for people in leadership roles to be effective at collaboration. So that's one group. The other group would be mostly just large global clients who are having problems with collaboration. They see that things are not running smoothly and they don't quite sure what to do about it.
Right.
And they've either read the book, or they've seen the TED Talk, or talked to somebody else that has done some radical collaboration work, and they realize this could help our team or our department or our division, whatever the organization that they need to focus on, whatever that might be.
Right. So I have a question, because as you're talking, I mean, over the years that I'm doing facilitation and work in collaboration settings, a lot of people say, yeah, we need to collaborate, or we are collaborating, but they're really not. So I'm curious, even when your book came out, people said they were collaborating. The book Radical Collaboration came out. What gap did you fill Radical Collaboration close for people in their understanding of what real collaboration is? Because I think to some degree people talk about it, but they aren't really doing it. So there's a disconnect somewhere. And how does the Radical Collaboration close that gap for people?
Well, there's always been talk about it, although I think there's much more talk these days than there was when we first started out. Mm-hmm. The difference is people talk about it, but they're not skillful at it. When I say the difference, I mean the paradox there is that they talk a lot about it, but they're not becoming more skillful.
Right.
And I think the gap that we can fill is we can teach some very practical skills that can help people become much more effective at collaboration, so they're not just talking about it. But I think, one of the biggest changes that I've seen from when we first started out, and I think when we wrote the book, we were a bit ahead of the wave, the curve on collaboration issues. And the level of collaboration that we were arguing for, that we were advocating, was actually pretty radical at the time. And the groups that were doing it produced some pretty radical results too, which is why we thought it was a good title, Radical Collaboration, because it wasn't just, let's get along. But over the years, I've seen more people talking about it. There's much more awareness about the importance of collaboration, but I don't see, generally speaking, people getting more skillful at it.
Right. So when you say that you guys were doing radical things with radical results, what were those radical elements? Because I would say they're probably still missing to some degree.
Well, yeah. I mean, what we were talking about was becoming so much more effective at relationship building and problem solving.
Right.
And we've broken it down into a bunch of different aspects.
Right.
Of that since then, but or in the book, compared to where we first started. When we first started, we actually developed this primarily as a conflict resolution tool. And over the years, we began to see how conflict avoidant most people are. And most people don't want to spend time learning how to deal with conflict better, but everybody wants to be better at collaboration. Right. And so when we wrote the Radical Collaboration book, we changed the focus of the work that we were doing away from what we don't want to what we do want. Mm-hmm. And so making that more of a positive shift in the direction of effective collaboration, I think was one of the things that got a lot of attention from organizations at the time.
Right.
Over the years, particularly during the past, I would say 7 to 10 years, it has become, the need for collaboration has become much more apparent to most organizations,
right.
Especially when we had the economic crisis around the world, because a lot of organizations had just cut to the bone and there was no fat left to cut. And one of the things that they realized that they were not tapping into as effectively as they could is how do you get people to work together more effectively?
Yeah.
And so then, there was a lot more interest in collaboration because most organizations today realize that it's virtually impossible for them to compete externally if they can't first collaborate internally. And I think a lot of organizations didn't realize that back when we first started. Some of them thought collaboration was good and everything, but they didn't realize the impact that poor collaboration was having on them until the economic crisis, when everybody needed to step up and give their best. And if people were being more passive and not as forcefully collaborating, it would really come back to bite them. Mm-hmm. And I think this trend towards more passive behavior in organizations is one of the more troubling trends that we've seen. It's one of the major reasons why we wrote the second edition of the book, because we were seeing that the cultures within organizations, when we first started out, we would see what we call a red zone culture, which is a more aggressive, adversarial, highly conflicted, more hostile environment.
Right.
at one end of the spectrum. At the other end of the spectrum, we would see what we call this green zone, which is a more collaborative, more supportive, more cooperative, more highly skilled at collaboration. And those were the two major cultures that we saw. And over the past number of years, we began to hear a lot of comments from people saying, well, we're obviously in the green zone because we don't fight. And they were confusing the absence of outright warfare as a sign of effective collaboration. We'd hear things like, well, if there's a problem, I just keep my mouth shut. I keep my eyes down and my mouth shut. And they thought that they were good at collaboration because they weren't fighting with each other. But that's just a much more passive, conflict avoidant version of this more aggressive red zone. So we started calling that the pink zone because it looks nicer. It seems nicer.
When did you introduce the pink zone into the radical collaboration, vernacular?
10 years ago, maybe.
Okay, so it's been about that 10 years. Because again, I think I've shared with you kind of a similar framework that I use around battleground, underground, common ground. I think it's the same element because a lot of time people spend in that pink zone, and it's really probably more dangerous when it comes to groups progress because people aren't opening up. They're subversive. They're working around. They're actually they don't see the impact of that because they're just so afraid to kind of bring conversations up to the table. And so I'm curious. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I think it is more dangerous.
Yeah.
It creates a bigger problem for people in organizations because if you go into a culture that is primarily pink zone, that is conflict avoidant, pink zone, you go into a meeting, and everybody's going, oh, okay, sure, yeah. It looks like they're all agreeing, and then when they leave the meeting, guess what happens? Absolutely nothing.
Right.
Because people are afraid to stand up and say, well, wait a minute, I think this is a bad idea. We shouldn't be putting time into that. So they nod their head, yes, and then they go out and don't do anything about it.
Right.
So if we have the opportunity to go into an organization, we find that it's much easier to work with a red zone environment to turn it around than it is a pink zone environment.
Oh, interesting. How do you gauge? How are you gauging that? I know there is you do a survey, is something you've introduced. Maybe you could talk. Is that one way you can you identify that through that tool?
Well, you can tell by some of the questions. In a red zone environment, the kinds of questions we ask are not, what's your culture like? We ask questions like, if people are solving problems, do they take into consideration all of the interests of all the other parties? Do they openly express a desire to collaborate? Do they hide mistakes? Do they feel safe enough to admit mistakes? Do they admit when they've made a mistake, things like that. If they're open about that, then it's more of an indication that they're closer to the green zone. If they're more aggressive and more assertive with each other and arguing and fighting a lot, that's more red zone. If they're more fearful and just quiet about what's going on, then they're more pink zone.
So there's a question that came up here, Jim, from Rody, and thank you, Rody. His question is, are you seeing generational differences with millennials entering the workforce affecting corporate culture regarding collaboration?
I'm sure that there are some, but most of the work that I do are with high-end leadership programs.
Yeah.
And so they tend to be, in their, from the 30s to the 50s. Country leadership roles, things like that.
Yeah,
I don't see it so much there.
Yeah, I was actually in the Bay Area last weekend, and I had some friends that work for some really big companies that I think we're all really aware of. And these are guys that are my age in the late 40s, early mid 50s, and they were talking about how much more sensitivity there is in the organization. So it's kind of almost like it's a pink zone, but it's more a matter of people are just walking on eggshells because they don't want to hurt other people's feelings, right?
Yeah.
They're trying to find the right words to say it in a way that it doesn't become a Me Too moment or and I think I think it's good to be mindful of how we communicate. And I think it's also important that people can just be really direct with other people to saying, hey, I disagree with your position on this, or I disagree with what you're thinking here. But they're so afraid because they might be perceived as being, this is part of their conversation, that they're insensitive to that particular person, especially if they're in a, if they're different color, different race, different gender. So there just seems to be my observation, there seems to be a level of sensitivity. I think there's a yearning to want to connect, but there's also this kind of veneer of insincerity because people don't want to hurt anyone's feelings.
I would say it's a level of fear.
Yeah, well, that definitely creates another level of pink zone, but it.
Go ahead.
I was just saying it feels like a different type of pink zone dynamic, right? It's not like an autocratic; it's more peer-to-peer related rather than a management-related thing, because I've seen management create cultures where it's oppressive, where that's where people don't want to talk. But I've seen it now in teams where people don't want to hurt each other's feelings. Yeah, it's a subtle shift there.
But it doesn't take a lot of effort or training to get people to be able to talk about this in a way that's more authentic.
Yeah.
It's possible to give people corrective feedback and to share your opinions in a way that's not offensive to people if you have some basic communication skills.
So what are some of just for the sake of the folks who may not be familiar with the work, but so how the 5 collaborative skill sets, would you mind kind of going through that with us?
Sure.
Yeah.
The first one we call collaborative intention. Mm-hmm. And this list of 5 is both a skill set and a mindset. It's a set of attitudes and a set of competencies that you can learn in a pretty short period of time and implement almost immediately, because it's pretty practical stuff and it can have a big impact on an organization almost immediately. So the first one we call collaborative intention. And this is more the mindset. And the key skill there is being able to focus on mutual gains in your relationships when you hit one of those speed bumps in the road. When somebody makes a mistake, does something that you don't understand or can't quite explain, can you stay in this collaborative green zone that we talk about and get curious, or do you go into the red zone and get furious? Mm-hmm. So it's paying attention to how can we support each other in the organization and through conflicts. The second one we're now calling openness. When we first started, we called it truthfulness. And the way we defined it was, do people feel safe enough to raise difficult issues and tell their truth? And over the years, I think people confused what our message was rather than do people feel safe enough to raise difficult issues? Are they honest? And clearly, if you want to destroy a relationship, being dishonest is one of the easiest, fastest ways that you can do that.
Right.
But in most organizational settings, that's not the issue. That's the problem. It's a greater problem for a lack of transparency. And the work that Will Schutz did, one of our mentors that created a program called The Human Element that we're both very involved in, mm-hmm. and has much of Will's work in the Radical Collaboration Program. His research found that one of the more important things that you can do to improve the effectiveness of any organization is generally increase the level of openness within that organization. And his research was 50, 60 years ago. Now, the most recent research that absolutely totally supports Will's earlier thinking is the work that was done by Google in their Project Aristotle, where they were looking at what makes a high-performing team versus a low-performing team.
Right.
And, they looked at everything that you could think of. If you could measure it and think of it, then they'd measure it. And they found that most of the things they looked at, they could put their teams together just as effectively by throwing a dart, because it just had no impact whatsoever.
Right.
But the thing that was so far and above everything else was something that they call psychological safety, which is a term created by Amy Edmondson from Harvard.
Right.
And so if there's a high level of psychological safety, meaning do people feel safe enough to raise difficult issues and tell their truth? Then, that made the difference between a high-performing team and a low-performing team. Oh yeah, there you are. You disappeared there for a minute.
Yep.
So we're calling this openness now because what we're trying to do is advocate for this level of transparency.
And I think when either Rhodey's asking a question or anyone, I mean, that seems to be the gateway out of either red or pink into the green is that openness one. To me, that just getting people to articulate what's blocking them from something and be able to express it. But to your point about Amy's work is feeling safe enough to say something.
Yeah.
Which I think it's interesting because I think that openness piece, what I'm finding too in organizations, and maybe, I don't know, you do a lot of stuff internationally, but it just seems like the rhetoric in our country is also influencing how people are showing up in the workplace. Because it's almost feeling like people are afraid to speak openly and honestly. And if they do, it becomes more of it almost seems like a lot of stuff goes in the red zone because of just the sheer climate that we're in, where people don't feel safe to just say, I disagree and still be okay. There seems to be a lot more fear, at least it's been my observation, but my goal has been in organizations to even surface some of these external factors that are impacting how people show up in their workplace. So
I think that's not just in the U.S. It's more apparent to us in the U.S. because our politics just sucks right at the moment.
Yeah.
But I see the same kind of trend all around the world, no matter where I go. Organizations, countries where it used to be so collaborative and so accepting and open and that felt so safe are now more partisan. It's just a trend that is disturbing to me around the world.
Yeah, which to me, that's why I'm so committed to the program and Radical Collaboration as a product and service that, I'm working with you and Lou and the community, and why the Commons is created, because we just cannot afford to go backwards. So we got to really embed this idea of collaboration to move through this stuff.
Well, the openness skill, there's a couple parts to it. One is you being more skillful at being open and authentic and saying what's on your mind in a skillful way without, offending people or challenging them in some ways. But a big part of creating this culture of openness is your ability to listen. And so we do spend time on that because just about everybody in the world has been through some listening classes, and it's oftentimes the most often taught, most unused skill in the world. And so if that's part of what it takes to create that safe environment, where people will actually listen to what the other person has to say and try to understand what they have to say, rather than you just have dueling monologues.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you look at the impeachment hearings these days. Nobody's listening to anybody, what they have to say between the two sides there,
Yeah.
They just wait their turn so they can make their monologue. And it's unfortunate. Yeah. So let me get back to the skills.
Sure.
The third skill we call self-accountability. And that's recognizing the choices that you make in life. Because what we have found is that if people can recognize what their own belief system is about how much choice they have, and in any given situation, if they could move up the scale a little bit on how much choice they believe they have, that can be very empowering. Even when it turns out you don't have as much choice as you would like.
Right.
But one of the things that we encourage people to do is, in any given situation, if it's uncomfortable for you, start looking at your own belief about how much choice you have. Most of us, in most situations, have more choice than we think we do.
Right.
A lot of those choices are difficult choices, and so we think, "Oh, I can't do that." I've got a spouse. I can't leave. I've got kids. I can't do this. I can't leave my job. Some of the choices are difficult, but if you realize, you do have choices there, it either frees you up to do something different, or it cuts down on the amount of whining and sniveling, because you realize, right, I'm choosing to stay here.
Right. Yep. It's
So
on that point, Jim. One of the things that's interesting, some of the organizations in DC that I've been working with, they're really trying to push this autonomy, moving decisions down to the lower level. And one of the challenges is that for years people have been told what to do. They didn't have, they were told, and so when you create that sense of helplessness. And people kind of buy into that, then they feel trapped that they don't have those choices. So trying to train people that, no, you do have a choice, and then they'll give the same excuses. Well, I can't leave my job. I got good benefits. It's like, okay, but that means you're choosing to stay. So what are you prepared to do? How can you at least find some sense of where you can be helpful in the situation rather than being, feeling helpless? Because, from a stress perspective, that sense of helplessness is a really big problem out there for a lot of people. So.
There was an experiment done, I believe it was the U.S. Forest Service, years and years ago, that we actually included in the first edition of the book, where they were able to dramatically improve the number of suggestions that people were making, because they told them that if they made a suggestion, and if it was legal and not clearly contrary to what they should be doing, if they didn't get an answer back within a certain period of time, they could go ahead and implement it. Well, that didn't just increase the number of suggestions that people made. It did do that. But what that did was change the dynamics about whether people felt helpless or powerful, whether they were mobilized or paralyzed. If they knew that if they came up with a suggestion, unless they were told they can't do it, they get to do it in a certain period of time. And it changed people's mindset. Yeah. And to have that difference in your mindset, boy, it was a powerful thing for the organization.
Right.
The number of people that made changes just increased dramatically.
Well, you can also see that self-accountability is tied to also that openness as well, because I'm choosing to step in, I'm choosing to create space so that we can be open together, so we can hear each other's ideas. What I appreciate, do you see that there's a pretty strong kind of relationship between, we've gone through 3 so far, but my experience has been, I'd love to hear your viewpoint on this, is just how connected they almost like the 5 skill sets really play off each other. Like you can't have one without a couple other ones in the mix, they can't be standalones.
Yeah, I think, if you're trying to change a culture, then you need the 4th skill too, which is self-awareness. Yeah. Because it's always going to start at self-awareness. Collaboration doesn't start within organizations. It starts within people. And if people are fearful, if they don't understand what they're doing, if they don't understand what motivates them, what their buttons are, things like that, if they get defensive in a situation, that's going to screw up any situation that you can deal with. So to me, it seems like the self-awareness piece is always a starting point for changing culture.
Do you see it as would it be like a self-awareness, then making choice or being open? Is there kind of an order to these, or is it just kind of?
Well, I don't think so. I don't think it's a clear order.
Okay.
You could have self-awareness, but if you don't have the collaborative intention, it's not going to work.
Right.
If people aren't accountable, they can be very aware. They can have the collaborative intention, but if they don't follow up on their decisions and their promises, is not going to work.
Right.
If people are fearful and they're not open because they're afraid to say what's on their mind, that's not going to work. If they have all those other skills and yet they still don't know how to negotiate their way through conflict in a way that supports the relationship, they're going to screw that up too. So
sure.
It's to me, it's more like dovetailing all of the skills together, or like shuffling a deck of cards there. You need to have them all.
Yeah.
The 4th skill is, as we call self-awareness. We focused on a couple of things there. One was how people like to behave when they're in relationships around 3 key behaviors: inclusion, control, and openness, because those 3 behaviors have a lot to do with compatibility and collaboration in an organization. So we try to get people to have a better understanding of what their preferences are, and then be able to flex, because sometimes you can move up on this skill, and sometimes you can move down on the skill. The situations are going to be very different. So you want people to not get rigid about what their preferences are. That's right. What gets us into trouble.
Right.
So that's self-awareness, the first part of self-awareness. The second part is increasing people's awareness about their own defensiveness. And this has been such an important issue because if people are trying to resolve conflict or build collaboration and they start getting defensive, it's like pouring blood and water to a shark. I mean, it's just going to create a feeding frenzy. And over the years, I don't think I have seen any single thing derail more people in leadership roles more than them getting defensive.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you typically by the time someone gets into a top leadership role, they've got the skill set. They understand whether it's banking or whether it's manufacturing or whatever. Generally, they have those skills. So it's mostly the interpersonal things that derail people. And number one factor more than anything else I've ever seen is when people get defensive.
Mm-hmm.
They don't recognize what's going on, that they're defending themselves from fears inside of us, inside of themselves,
Right.
So we put a lot of effort on that. And it's not so much that we're trying to eliminate everyone's defensiveness.
Right.
Defensiveness is a human condition. That's going to happen.
Right.
What we're trying to do, though, is give people more awareness about what their defensiveness is about and help them spot their defensiveness at an earlier point in the process,
Right.
Before it's too late.
Right.
So much of what happens with our defensiveness is unconscious to us. And so most of us don't even recognize that we're getting defensive until we've already screwed up the relationship or we've made some damage in the argument,
Right. Right.
and caused some problems. So if we can get people to understand that when they get defensive, it's because they have some fear inside of them, and then help them spot that at an earlier point in the process before it's too late for them to do something about it, before they've done the damage, that can be very helpful to them and help them, get through difficult situations in relationships.
Jim, I think the reason why I've always loved working with this material because it ties so well into the neuroscience work, right? So it's this idea of being able to articulate it. I'm able to manage the limbic part of the brain because I have the executive functioning in place. So with that executive functioning part of the brain or that braking system, I've really found that the exercises we do on the self-awareness is really about developing those brake pads in a way, much, or like you said, much earlier on, so they can really manage that dynamic. Because again, it's to your point, I think what I've really appreciated since I've been introduced to you and human element material is just kind of decoupling my past narratives to my present choices, right? So there's that awareness is really, and to feel in a way where the feelings are really just information that I have a power to choose to do something with and reframe it in a way that serves me in the relationship. And I think that's been just huge for me in the work that I've been doing as a facilitator, as much as it is a participant or in a relationship. So it's been, I've really appreciated that content immensely. So. I mean,
we walk around with our stories, with our projections in our head. You look at two people on an airplane and a little kid and an old man, and it starts getting bumpy, and the old man becomes fearful, and the little kid gets excited.
Exactly.
Oh, this is a fun ride. Well, they're in the same airplane. It's what's the story that's changing it. And what we see is when we start getting defensive, when we become fearful and we get defensive and we start protecting ourselves, our brain shuts down and we get this tunnel vision, so anything that we can do to reactivate our brain, focusing outward, looking at different colors in the room, looking at trying to pay attention to the different sounds in the room, so that's one step. Right. The next step though, is to focus inward and look for that fear. Because anytime we're getting defensive, there's some fear there. Right. And, like they say, if you're looking for fraud, financial fraud, the buzzword is follow the money, follow the money trail. If you're talking about personal responsibility and defensiveness and self-awareness, it's follow the fear. Because everything that gets us into trouble is when we become fearful and it paralyzes us. So one of the things I think we do a better job in the second edition than we did in the first edition is helping people recognize that fear, to tap into that fear, and then just see what they can do about it, even if they have a difficult time doing that in the moment when they're defensive. You know, if they can go back later on after they've left the room and say they screwed it up when they were together, but if they can go back the next opportunity that they have and just visualize the whole thing and go back through it in their own mind and let themselves relive it as though it was happening in the moment, they're still creating those new neural networks, you know.
Yeah. Yep.
And it can over time that can make a difference, even if they aren't able to do it in the moment.
Right. I'm just curious to know, because one of the things I share in groups when people get stressed, you know, they become self-absorbed or self-interested. And so because I know that the fifth element is, you know, interest-based negotiation and problem solving, and was part of the design consciously really thinking about some of the work that Will's done in terms of the interest of either being significant, feeling significant, competent, or liked. Those are interests as well that aren't being served in these moments, that's what's the trigger for the fear. Is that kind of how you've interpreted it? Because that's how I've kind of interpreted it in my mind. I don't know if that's kind of the next logical step, but it feels like when I get stressed out or I'm getting fearful, it's because a need or interest isn't being met or it's being violated, and that's what's triggering for me, right? So I don't know if that's...
Well, yeah. I mean, since we're at skill number 5, it's interest-based negotiations or problem solving. It's being able to be more skillful about resolving the conflicts that are inevitable in any kind of an ongoing long-term relationship. I mean, if you have an ongoing working relationship and you don't have any conflict in there, it's probably not as productive a relationship as it could be, because you're not pushing as much as you could be. But what we've found in looking at the differences between the new models of negotiation and the old models of negotiation. The old models, like when I was in law school back in the early 1970s, there were a whole bunch of books that came out at the time that would give suggestions for tactical advantages. You know, like put your opponent, they even called them your opponent, put your opponent in a shorter chair so you would look down on them from the power position, you know, or withhold important information and then slam it down on the table to show that you have more information, or you know, arrange the furniture so the sunlight would reflect into their eyes. And all this was done to try to rattle the other person, to make them feel insignificant, incompetent, and unlikable. The three behaviors, you know, we're talking about significance, competence, and likability that comes from Will's research. And so the whole theory was, you rattle the other person, you make them feel that way, and it'll give you an advantage. But what we have found over the years was that might work if you're talking about a one-shot negotiation. Right. But we almost never have that situation as a one-shot negotiation, particularly if what we're trying to do is build more collaborative relationships, stronger, more effective working relationships within organizations. I mean, what goes around comes around. There's always going to be another opportunity to interact with that individual. You know? Right. So we have found that if you can help people feel significant and competent and likable, guess what? They are significantly better at problem solving. Right. So we tell people these days, you know, let go of all those little negotiating tricks and tactics to try to give you an advantage, and instead create this safe environment where people feel psychologically safe, right? Where they feel they can be more creative, they can brainstorm, they can say what's on their mind, they can talk about their fears and their feelings and their hopes and ideas, you know, and their values. And if people feel safe enough to do that, they are going to be significantly better at problem solving. Yeah. Yeah. So with those 5 skill sets in the new book and the new version, you said you made some changes around some of the self-awareness pieces, or just you expanded upon those. Any other things that you added to the introduction of the pink zone, it sounds like, but any other elements that are in there that because of what you've learned over the years? Well, the biggest differences were the addition of the culture piece, the pink zone, because we've seen that as the biggest change, at least that we've been aware of. Sure. Right now, pink zone cultures are clearly the most predominant culture among all of our client bases. And I think the research is pretty clear that it's probably becoming the most predominant culture in, at least in the corporate world, in organizational life in general.
Mm-hmm.
It's pretty consistent that I've seen that, whether you're talking about veterinary hospitals or higher education or even the military or in government. I see the pink zone culture as being what's the dominant culture these days. So
Right.
that's the biggest change. And I think that's the most important thing that we've added to the book.
Yeah. What's been your biggest, I mean, share some examples of how you've been able to move people effectively out of that pink or red zone into the green zone? I mean, I know that you have, but I'd just be curious to know from the corporate, like the metrics that you're using to kind of gauge the value of the green zone versus the pink zone. Because even your TED Talk, you talk about the cost of that red zone, green zone, but have they really been able to say, you know, hey, this route of collaboration has definitely increased the green zone significantly?
Yeah, I think so. And I think what it takes is this coordination of all the skills. It isn't one skill that's going to make the difference. It takes all of them, because people do need to feel safe if they're going to try out new behaviors. They need to be able to solve problems in a way that's going to, provide them with some measure of satisfaction, positive change. They need to have a collaborative attitude. So you need to have all of it. It isn't just one thing that's going to make a difference. But if you can give people some basic skills, and if you can give them some security that they're not going to be beaten up if they think differently than other people, that goes a long way. And when you can make just a little bit of shift, if you start making this shift, and then you have a critical mass of people within the organization that are supporting it, then it starts, becoming a steamroller that's hard to stop. If you get a lot of people on board and they're willing to talk about whether they're in the red zone or the pink zone or the green zone, they're willing to talk about whether they're feeling defensive or not. They're willing to listen. And if they're not feeling listened to, they're willing to call somebody on that. They're looking at ways to be self-accountable. They do what they say they're going to do. They try not to get defensive. They're solving problems in a positive way. If you get a critical mass of people that do that, boy, it's powerful and it's hard to stop.
Yeah,
and you can see it go through an organization like a wave.
It was interesting. It was, so a woman who had participated in one of the Route of Collaboration courses that I had taught, she actually created she put on a popsicle stick. On one half was the red. She made she cut out all these chicken things. She put red on one side and green on the other side, and she gave it to her team. Right. Yeah. And she they now have a common language, which is also a really key in terms of they being able to, and I think even talk about how that one group of grad students, just that exercise alone of just that, the self-awareness of, am I in the red zone or the green zone and now, or pink zone, that self-awareness component. So they actually now in meetings, she gave everyone one of these popsicle sticks, and they hold it up. Right. So, and it's kind of like funny at the same time, people they stop, to your point, they stop and listen. But I mean, simple little things like that have been some of the things that I've seen people starting to doing as a result of increasing their awareness around this one. So it's been that I'll send you the photo so you can share it, but it's brilliant. Yeah. Yeah.
One of the things we did when we first started this project in California, which was all with labor management groups.
Yeah.
We gave, and so much of the conversation had to do with the elephants in the room, what people weren't talking about. So we gave each of the chief negotiators, the management negotiator and the union negotiator, a little stuffed toy elephant. So they could go into a meeting, they could bring the elephant with them, and they could put the elephant on the table, and they could say, we have an elephant in the room and we need to talk about it. And it just that little thing helped them raise a difficult issue in a way that didn't seem to be antagonistic. We need to talk about this, so let's do that. So a lot of little things that can do that, but you need to have the skills, you need to have the attitude and the mindset to make that work.
Yeah. Do you, I guess with, I mean, I'm excited for the new book to come out. Can't wait to get it. Can't wait to share it again. But I'm just curious to know with all the work you and Malou, you guys are doing some new stuff too, because it's not just the book and the training. You guys have also started to create kind of an online support tool as well.
Yeah. Something we're very excited about, because right from the very start, one of the things when this project started in California back in the late 1980s, it was a labor management project. And one of the things that we were trying to do, hang on just a minute.
Okay.
Something wrong with my, Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
So I forgot.
You were talking about excited the new software back in the 80s.
Oh yeah. So one of the things that we did that was really smart was we had a lot of money from the state of California and the Hewlett Foundation, so we could be really choosy who we would take into the program. So we had a lot of money, so we could make it very advantageous. And we wouldn't take a group in there unless they let us do at least a year's worth of follow-up with that group. And I was assigned to do all the follow-up for about the first 3.5 years. So we could see that it was really having an impact. And then over the years, we've seen the research is pretty clear that groups that do a significant amount of follow-up implement these skills at a much higher rate than other groups. I mean, groups without follow-up, they still have dramatic improvements. But if you add a follow-up program to that, it's like 30 to 50% higher. And so what we have found is that groups keep asking us, what can we do for follow-up? How can we keep this alive? So over about the past year and a half, Malou Leray, she's one of our master RC trainers from Belgium. She and I have been working on a follow-up program that's online. It's 34 weeks long. Each lesson it starts off with a video recording talking about one of the 5 skills, some aspect of one of the 5 skills, and we cycle through all 5 of them several times. So we talk about some aspect, then we have a list of the key learnings from that video. Then we have a couple exercises for people to do in order to practice the skills.
Right.
Then partway through the lesson, they would get access to an audio file, which is a reflective exercise on how well they did in the other exercises. And then they have another optional exercise if they want to dig down deeper into that particular skill. And this goes on for 34 weeks. And we're just getting ready to launch that now. And we're thinking it's going to have a big impact on people who have gone through the workshop, particularly teams that go through the workshop.
Right.
Because they're going to be going through these exercises together and working with each other on it. So I'm excited about this as I am practically anything that we've done.
Yeah, well, I'm excited.
Really
I think you and I talked last week with a potential. I think we're going to be building that into another client's that's taking on the Radical Collaboration. So again, as being a steward of your content and the material, because I really think that it works. I know that some of the folks on this call have definitely keep referring back to how it's been a game changer for them as well. So I'm excited that you gave us some time, but I'm just curious also, where do you see the future of collaboration and Radical Collaboration going? I mean, where's this with all the work you put into it? What do you see?
Well, I think we still have a lot of work ahead of us.
Oh, there's no question.
This is not self-evident stuff, even though it is simple. Yeah. It's simple and easy to learn, and if you have the skills, it can make a huge difference. But it takes paying attention to it, and so we need people out there within organizations, particularly. Yeah. Who have these skills, who have the ability to teach other people how to do that. I don't think it's going to happen on its own, just like I don't think if it would happen on its own, we'd be seeing it in politics these days. And we're seeing exactly the opposite.
Right. Yeah.
I think there is a tendency, if you don't pay attention to this, it's going to get worse.
Yeah.
So even though it's pretty clear that if they do pay attention and they do become more skillful, it can make a dramatic improvement in the organization. I mean, there was one study by John Cotter and Jim Heskett, both Harvard professors, very well respected. They did an 11-year study in the corporate world. And the organizations that were much more collaborative and much more effective and paid attention to all the stakeholders, they increased their net income by 756% compared to those organizations that were more red zone,
right,
that were not as supportive. They went up 1%. So a 755% difference in the growth of their net income over this period that they were studying.
Right.
You know, and there's one study after another that says
right,
a collaborative culture will kick the butt of an adversarial culture.
Right.
But cultures don't become collaborative by themselves.
Right.
You need to give people those skills. And so I would say the future is going to be a bit like, you know, holding back the waves of the ocean. You're going to be, you know, taking a step forward and a step back, and hopefully you can make some progress, but it takes paying attention.
Right. So the whole idea of the collaborative commons, Jim, is really to kind of give people tools, supports, ideas, and in addition to, of course, I'll be, you know, I'll be cheeky and say, you know, in addition to getting, you know, trained in radical collaboration, what sort of things could you share with folks who may not have been exposed to your material yet? I'm working on it. Mm-hmm. What other sort of kind of bits of advice to be effective at kind of leading collaborative efforts, having these 5 skills? Are there any other, you know, just things you want people to be aware of in terms of how they need to either show up, be aware of, attuned to, so that they can be effective at this work?
Well, I think particularly in organizations, it's important that people start paying more attention to what the culture of the organization is. Because if you don't know where you are, it's hard to figure out where to go. And so I think paying attention to how people resolve their conflicts, how people relate to each other, you know, how open are they? How honest, transparent are they? I'll use that. So that's going to make a big difference, I think. But that requires that you know, people start paying attention to what the skill levels are, to how people are treating each other, how they resolve conflicts.
How do you get prepared to step into, I mean, there's definitely that awareness, but when you're going into a client site where you're, you know, and I know you're doing a lot more talks and you're not necessarily doing, you're kind of training at the higher level, but because I think for me in this material, I really work to embody it as much as I can. And I'm just curious, you know, over the years that you've been doing this practice, what's been the most, I guess, pivotal kind of insight that you glean from the work that you've written, published, produced, practiced? What's been the most powerful, I guess, bit of advice that you share that you actually live yourself?
Whoa, that's a question. I guess paying attention to attitude has been one of the bigger things for me. How much my attitude impacts how effective I am, and how unconscious I can be about what my attitude is. So if I can be more deliberate about that and more aware about that, I tend to be able to navigate difficult situations much more effectively.
What do you use when you start to realize that your attitude's kind of shifting in your own kind of internal red or pink zone? What do you do to kind of get yourself back to your A game?
When it works.
And hopefully it's something you don't have to be prescribed or you have to drink too heavily on it.
No, but it's I would say the most significant thing is getting curious.
Yeah.
If I can, anytime I see myself getting defensive, if I can come back with, oh, look at this, I'm getting defensive. What's that about? What am I feeling fearful about right now? If I can have that attitude, boy, that just that makes a change like that. And, and I'm getting better at it because I pay attention to it, but I still get triggered sometimes.
I witnessed you in Belgium. Remember, you were trying to change your flight, and you're getting a bit perturbed. And it was such an interesting thing to watch and observe you, because the trigger was the arbitrary nature of them saying yes or no to things that didn't seem at all make any sense. and then you and I talked about it. It was interesting because you brought up an insight around growing up and having adults in your life make an arbitrary decision. It would just piss you off, kind of thing. It was just like,
I had exactly the same thing happen at the last trainer certification program. I got a call from a hotel, and they had made a really arbitrary decision about something. And it was like, I was so triggered, and then it was like, oh, I get it. That's what this is about here, and once I could make that shift, it was like $100 room or something. This was not a big deal in my life, Yet to feel like somebody had arbitrary control over me. So, having that history, working those issues in the past, now I tend to catch it much quicker. I don't always catch it, but I do a better job than I used to anyway. So it's like, okay, that's me getting triggered again about feeling arbitrary. So is this really that big of a deal? What's going on here? No, it really isn't. I'm feeling like I'm 5 years old.
But for me, it was such, but it was so interesting to me, because I think that's the other part of this is like this, to your point, even in the TED Talk you gave, it's not a model of perfection, right? It's a model of continuous improvement. Like it's like,
it's a recovery model.
Yeah, it's such a recovery model. And I think that's the other part of it too, is that, at least in my observation, a lot of people are maybe be fearful to step into their own shadow. But the reality, that's where the learning's going to happen. And I think the same thing when I work with groups is that, groups have to kind of step into their own shadow to kind of work through that stuff, or the elephant or the dog poop or whatever they talk about in those metaphors. But I just think it's fascinating if we can, I know that when I'm holding the space of, collaborative mindset, I'm self-aware, I'm being aware of my choices as a facilitator, I'm much more influential and have ability to create a space where others can do the same. So for me, it's about, if I'm really embodying this and I'm living it, it definitely can have an impact for those in the room that I'm training and or facilitating. So I found these skills not just useful in collaboration, but in leading collaboration as well. So it's been fantastic. I'm really grateful to have you in my life. I really am.
So for me too. I love the work that you're doing. I love how you're spreading it. You're doing a good job there, and getting other people involved in it too. So it's fun for me. The most satisfying thing for me is seeing the ripples that go out, because I can see the difference that you're making in the organizations that you're working with and the lives of the people in those organizations, and I see that every place I look. So it's quite rewarding.
Yeah, I want to ask. Thank you, Jim. And like I said, you're a great colleague, mentor, friend. But anybody who've been listening, do you have any questions for Jim? If you do, feel free to ask, and maybe we can do a little bit of Q&A. And you have like 5 seconds to write it up. How's that?
going once.
Yeah, exactly.
Going twice. Yeah.
Because we're right at an hour, and I don't want to take up too much more of your time.
Yeah.
It doesn't look like there's any questions coming. So, Jim, again, so the book's coming out. How can people access your book? Can they get it through your website, or is it just on Amazon? Or
well, through the website or on Amazon's the best way. Amazon gives a nice discount on it, I think. So Amazon, I'd encourage people to take a look at the TED Talk. You can just Google Jim Tamm on defensiveness, and it's only 14 minutes, but it's a nice reminder for us. Anybody that's been through the Radical Collaboration Program, you want more information about this online follow-up program, send me an email. It's jimtam@radicalcollaboration.com.
Yeah. And I was sharing with you, we're going to actually be putting, we have dates on the calendar for 2020. So we'll get that up on your website as well. It'll be on our website. And we're going to continue to grow. As I was sharing with you, Joseph and myself are putting on, these conversations in the Collaborative Commons. We're doing the little mini modules called the sheet between us, which is pretty fun. Yeah. But the idea is to really continue to grow a network of collaborators that are doing good work and need the support. So it's nice to know that you're on our side. So
I am, and firmly in your camp. So I thank you so much for that.
Thanks, Jim. I appreciate it. And thank you, everyone who joined the call. And we'll be posting this up soon. Jim, have a wonderful Thanksgiving.
Thanks. You too.
All right, brother.
Enjoy your family.
All right. Okay. Bye-bye. See ya.
Bye-bye.